Kate Wishart.
Yes. I'm grateful to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a real pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, and as a fellow chair of the Science and Technology Committee, he certainly knows a thing or two about good evidence, and it's actually quite encouraging and unusual to see an issue to do with drugs where the government is accepting evidence and doing the right thing. This is a really good statutory instrument. It is a good reform of the Misuse of Drugs Act. Of course, synthetic cannabinoids, which could be used in research to try and develop some of the treatments that we know work, which could help countless people across all our constituencies, should be taken right out of the scheduling when it comes to misuse of drugs. So this is the right thing, but it is so unusual to see them accepting good evidence. This is a government that approaches drugs issues uninformed by evidence and is singularly unresponsive to the development and the debate about drugs issues, the general environment that is emerging and as a feature of all our constituencies and our communities. Turns their face against the international innovations which are springing up from not just Canada, but places like Portugal, places like Germany, places where there is a real different approach to how we deal with the contagion of drugs-related problems that we have within our community. This is a government that's quite immune to the mayhem its general policy towards drugs is currently generating. Mr Deputy Speaker, the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act isn't just in need of minor tinkering, it's in need of widespread reform, review and updating. Now, we are conducting an inquiry into problem drug use in Scotland, and we're doing this because in 2 weeks' time we expect to see that over 1,000 people will have died as a result of drug use. That is 1,000 families impacted by deaths that needn't have happened and things that we could do in order to try and address and resolve this. We had a fascinating session yesterday, and I want to share this with the Minister so you could properly hear it, because we don't know if they're coming to our committee, but you'll have to answer these questions. The Home Office will have to address the way that it's currently handling drugs issues and policy. So come to our committee and tell us what you're going to do, because some way or other we will get the answers from the Home Office about this. But yesterday's session was absolutely fascinating. We had senior police officers from all across the United Kingdom. We even had a representative of the government's own advisory council on the misuse of drugs. There is overwhelming consensus and agreement that the criminal justice approach to drugs issues isn't working and is failing. It's failing our communities, it's failing our constituencies, and particularly for those bereaved, it has ultimately failed them. We heard not just about this useful statutory instrument where there's a reclassification which is actually liberalising policy, but the constant ratcheting up, as a chief senior police officer put it, of drugs classification. Look at the example of cannabis, just generally cannabis. Cannabis was a classified B drug. It went down to classification C, and it's back up to classification B again. This is the continuing ratcheting up that we see when it comes to these things. Now, we're hearing that there's an overwhelming consensus and that something different is required. And that difference is that we have to start to treat drug issues as a health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. And I know that my colleagues within the Health and Social Care Committee are also looking at this to see if the general policy and consequences could be changed. And I'm grateful to the Health and Social Care Committee because on Monday... Yes, of course I'll give way.
Very grateful. I meant to mention this case when I spoke earlier, but there's a case of a family in Norwich who have just had to spend well over £1,000 on a private prescription for their young son who has epilepsy. They won't, as a family, be able to afford more than a few weeks' worth of paying for this privately. How ludicrous is it that that family, desperately in need of help for their young boy, cannot get it through the NHS? I think only 3 prescriptions so far under the NHS.
It's very important. Now, they'll load it to drift. I don't want it to drift too far from where out of scope too much. If I can bear that in mind, Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, and that is definitely the point, and it's all about this particularly statutory instrument, because what this statutory instrument will do will help people like the family that the Honourable Gentleman mentions, that will supply the evidence and the research so that this could happen. But it's unacceptable that people currently, because they haven't got this in place, are having to go abroad and they are still being arrested when they come back to the United Kingdom, something that was in the report of the Health and Social Care Committee today. So progress has been made, but we are looking forward, not to looking at the whole issue of cannabis when we go to Portugal to see how decriminalisation has worked there. Portugal, which had drug deaths on a par with what Scotland is currently experiencing, practically being cut down to manageable levels because of their approach to cannabis and to decriminalisation. Now, yesterday, as I was saying to the Minister, it was a fascinating session. Let me just tell him something that the Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland said, because it's important for this particular instrument. What he said to us, there are 61,500 problematic users in Scotland just now. It is growing in number. For the vast majority, the end for them is death. And the criminal justice process is actually pushing people into a place where there is more harm. That is an Assistant Chief Constable responsible for keeping people safe. Now, a Minister of his own advisory council said this: we are seeing police creating ways to reduce the harm done by the Misuse of Drugs Act. If we fully implemented the law of possession, we would be creating harm. This is what we are hearing from everybody. But what are we hearing from the government? Well, we don't know, because they won't come to our committee to tell us what they actually feel about this. They're not prepared to come and defend this, which is totally unacceptable. So we now need to hear that they're prepared to come in front of this. But when they do talk about drugs issues, do you know what the policy is? We don't want to send the wrong signal. We don't want to send the wrong signal. Fat lot of good that does to people 6 foot under the ground as a result and a consequence of failed drug policies as part of our ever-increasing drug deaths. Now, the Home Secretary is happy to dispense with all the compelling evidence, everything he hears, all the international examples about drug consumption rooms, because, as he said, of his own childhood experience in his own personal neighbourhood. The government knows the evidence about drug consumption rooms. The government has even accepted the evidence about drug consumption rooms. The only thing the government hasn't done is do anything about it. People are dying. Do something about it. This works. All international evidence shows that drug consumption rooms make a difference. It stops people dying, and it allows them the treatment and recovery services that they should be entitled to. It's appalling that the government has one message on this: the belief that a drugs war could be prosecuted in one. All we need is the kids from Grange Hill and Nancy Reagan singing "Just Say No." It is time that this government grew up and accepted the real range of issues when it comes to this. We know that a health approach to drugs issues is required. We know that problematic drug use is a result of a complex cocktail of deprivation, poor mental health, trauma, stigma and addiction disorders. But the government's policy does nothing about this. Now, we want the government to attend our committee to defend their current drugs policy. I say to the Minister again, in his summing up, he can get his notes from his civil servants, just to get them to come and say there will be somebody coming to our committee who will give us evidence and is prepared to defend the government's policy, because right now it is unacceptable.
Minister.